Okay, guys, we're going to be doing a writing journal together. So you need a writing journal, you need a highlighter, a pencil, and a red pen. Okay, we're not going to need any pages from our packet. We're just going to get started on the page that we're going to write on. So the last page we did in our notebook was the plural possessive nouns. And you're just going to go ahead and go to the page, whatever page is after that for you. Okay. On the right side of the page, we're going to start writing, and we're going to do a dialogue rules anchor chart. So we're just going to write dialogue rules. And you talked about that a little bit today with your teacher. Dialogue are the exact words a person says, either out loud in a conversation or in a story where you read characters' conversations. That is dialogue. So the first rule is quotation marks go around the words that are said. So go ahead and write that down. Remember, you can pause this video whenever you need to. So quotation marks go around the words that are said. We're going to go ahead and highlight this. So we're going to do quite a bit of writing on this page. I don't want everything to get mixed together. And then I'm going to do 3 examples of dialogue. And you see the first example I wrote is Regina said, I want Chick-fil-A. What is it exactly Regina said? Regina said, I want Chick-fil-A. So my quotation marks go before the first word she said, which was I, and after the last word she said, which was A. So here are my quotation marks around the words that are said. I can also, here's my speech tag. This that is tells me Regina said, that is called the speech tag or the dialogue tag. I can also have the dialogue tag go at the end. So here's my dialogue tag at the end. The dialogue tag tells me who said this, or it's also called the speech tag. But again, my quotation marks are around the words that are being said. So what did Regina say? I want Chick-fil-A. My quotation marks are before I, and my quotation marks are after A. And then we have an advanced way to write dialogue, and that is when we have the dialogue tag or the speech tag in the middle. And so here I have my speech tag or my dialogue tag in the middle. But if you look at my quotation marks, I have them before and after what she said. So I have quotation marks before I have quotation marks after A, then I have my dialogue tag or my speech tag, and then I have quotation marks before right and quotation marks after now. So my quote is interrupted. I put my speech tag in the middle, but my quotation marks are continued on both sides of my example. The next rule is the first letter in dialogue is capitalized unless it is split by a dialogue tag. So here it is. Go ahead and write that. The first letter in dialogue is capitalized unless it is split by a dialogue tag. And I'll go ahead and show you what this means and what it should look like. So I'm going to do my first example with the dialogue tag on the beginning. So here's my example with the speech tag at the beginning. Josue said, and then if we follow the first rule, I have quotation marks before the first word Josue said and after the last word Josue said. Now I have a second capitalization rule, which says the first letter in dialogue is capitalized. So Josue is capitalized because it's the first word of the sentence and also because it's a proper noun. But then I have inside the quotation marks, because it is the first letter of the dialogue, I have this letter F, which is also capitalized. So when we speak, even though we don't see our words, we know that we speak in proper sentences and proper grammar. So our first letter of every word is also capitalized. In the next example I'm going to do, it's going to have this dialogue tag at the end. Okay, so again, we're following the first rule of having the quotation marks before the first word that is spoken and after the last word that is spoken. And then we have to follow the second rule of capitalizing the first word of the dialogue, which is fourth. And in this case, it is actually capitalized not only because it's the first word of the dialogue, but also because it is the very first sentence of the first word, of this entire sentence. In the next example, I'm going to show you this exception, unless it is split by a dialogue tag. And my speech tag or my dialogue tag is going to be in the middle of my next example. Okay, so in this example, you see that I have my dialogue tag in the middle. My first letter of the dialogue is capitalized, also because it's the first word of the whole sentence. But then look at the next part, unless it is split by a dialogue tag. So what Josue said was fourth grade is fun even though we have to wear masks. This part of the dialogue, even though it's the first part of the split quotation, is not going to be capitalized because it's not the beginning of what he said. It is interrupted or it is split by this dialogue tag of said Josue. My next rule is going to be punctuation goes inside the quotation marks, and I'll show you what this means. Okay, so punctuation goes inside the quotation marks. I'm going to show you in my first example with the dialogue tag at the beginning again. So here I have my speech tag at the beginning, or my dialogue tag. Sheila asked, and then I have the first rule. Quotation marks go around the words that are said. The first word Sheila said was do. The last word she said was dance. So there are my quotation marks. I also followed the second rule of capitalizing the first letter of the dialogue, which was the D in do. And now I have a third rule. The third rule is that punctuation mark goes inside the quotation. So here's my quotation. If I have a question mark or a period or whatever it is I have, it has to go inside. It has to be hugged by the quotation marks on the end. In the next example, I will put the speech tag at the end. So here's my next example with the dialogue tag at the beginning. I have my first rule, quotation marks around the words that were said. So quotation marks before do, quotation marks after dance. I followed the second rule of capitalizing the first letter of the dialogue. And then I followed the third rule, punctuation goes inside the quotation marks. Here is my question mark inside of the quotation marks. In the next example, I'm going to split my quotation mark and put the dialogue tag in the middle of the quote. So here is my third example. I'm following the first rule. Quotation marks go around or before the first word and the last word that is said. If my quotation is split, then I put quotation marks before the second part and of the last and first word of she said or he said. I followed the second rule. I capitalized the first letter of the dialogue, which was the D in do, and I followed this part unless it is split by a dialogue tag. So in is not capitalized because it is split or interrupted by the dialogue tag. And then I followed the final rule, which is punctuation goes inside the quotation mark. I have my comma, which goes inside the quotation marks here. And I have a question mark, which also goes inside the quotation marks at the end. The next rule, rule number 4, this is the final rule, is a comma separates your dialogue from your dialogue tag. So a comma separates your dialogue from your dialogue tag. Go ahead and write that down. And then I'm going to give you the first example again with the dialogue tag or the speech tag at the beginning. Remember, that tells me who is saying these words. Okay, so I have my first example with the speech tag or the dialogue tag at the beginning. Mateo said, look at the fourth rule, a comma separates your dialogue from your dialogue tag. So this is my dialogue tag. This is the actual dialogue Mateo said. I have a comma to separate both. And then I followed the first rule, quotation marks around the first word, my, and the last word, pizza, quotation marks. I followed the second rule, which was capitalizing the first letter of the dialogue, which is the M in my. And I followed the third rule, which is putting the punctuation mark at the end, in this case it's a period, inside the quotation marks. So my period before the quotation marks. In the next example, I'm going to write the dialogue tag at the end. So I have my speech tag at the end. I started with the dialogue. I followed the first rule, quotation marks around the words being said. So quotation marks before my, quotation marks after pizza. I followed the second rule for two reasons, not only because it's the first word of the dialogue, M in my, but also because it's the first word of the entire sentence. I followed the third rule, putting the punctuation mark, in this case a comma, inside the quotation marks. And I followed the fourth rule in the same way because I have a comma that separates the dialogue from the dialogue tag. That's how we know what was said and who said it. In the final example, I'm going to put the speech tag or the dialogue tag in the middle. So this is the final example. I have the speech tag or the dialogue tag in the middle. I have the first rule, which are quotation marks around the words that are said. So before my, after pizza. In this case, the dialogue tag is in the middle, so I need quotation marks again when the dialogue starts, which is before and after breadsticks. I followed the second rule, which is capitalizing the first word of the dialogue, which is the M in my, unless it is split by a dialogue tag, and that's why the and is not capitalized, because it is split with the dialogue tag. I followed the third rule, which is punctuation marks go inside the quotation. So I did that twice, here in pizza and here after breadsticks with the period. So the comma and the period are inside the quotation marks. And the final punctuation is that a comma separates the dialogue from the dialogue tag. So this is the dialogue tag. We have a comma before and after the dialogue tag. And you'll notice that for each one where the dialogue tag was in the middle. So comma before, comma after, comma before, comma after, comma before, comma after, every time the speech tag was in the middle or the dialogue tag was in the middle. This is what your journal should look like. I hope you paused the video whenever you needed to, and you're ready for tomorrow's lesson with your teacher.